Humans have had a fascination with time travel for hundreds of years. One of the earliest fictional stories was The Clock That Went Backward by Edward Page Mitchell in 1881, and since then, some of the greatest minds on Earth have given it some serious thought. Most scientists believe that it can never be done, but some, like astrophysicist Ron Mallett, have dedicated decades of their lives to the notion that time travel is possible. Hundreds of people have claimed that they've traveled through time, but most of them have been debunked. However, a select few credible stories baffle even the experts, and their details make serious cases that time travel could very well be possible. Here are 10 strong cases for the existence of time travel. Victor Godard briefly slipped forward in time. In 1935, Robert Victor Godard flew across an abandoned Royal Air Force base in Drem, Scotland. It was built during World War I but was now abandoned. A storm suddenly covered his plane in brownish-yellow clouds, and he plummeted down towards the base. When the clouds lifted, the airfield was suddenly restored and teeming with pilots and mechanics. He saw a monoplane which was too advanced for the Air Force in 1935. The planes were yellow and the mechanics' overalls were blue. These were colors not used by the Air Force at the time. He slipped back into the clouds and continued his journey. 4 years later, in 1939, he found that the now restored Drem airfield had the newly developed monoplane. The Air Force had changed their plane color to yellow and the mechanics' overalls were blue. His experience has been deemed very credible and later labeled a time slip. J. Bernard Hutton and Joachim Brandt. In 1932, German reporter J. Bernard Hutton and photographer Joachim Brandt were assigned a story on the Hamburg shipyard. When they arrived, bombs began dropping all around them. They found cover and barely escaped with their lives. Brandt managed to snap a few pictures of the mass destruction before they ran off. Since 1932, 7 years before the beginning of World War II, no one at their newspaper believed that bombs would be dropped over Hamburg. More confusing was that their photographs showed the buildings unharmed. 11 years later, in 1943, Hutton was shocked when he read a story in an English paper about an air raid on Hamburg. The pictures showed the exact scenery the men had witnessed and thought that they had photographed. Hutton and Brandt seem to have leapt forward in time, and their story has never been discredited. The Vanishing Car from 1940. In 1969, men going by LC and Bob were driving down Route 167 in Louisiana and came up behind a vintage car. The license plate read 1940, which was odd because these cars were not allowed on the roads unless in ceremonial parades. The female driver was in a 1940s dress and hat with a fur coat, and her small child was in a heavy coat with a cap. They were frantically looking around as if they dropped in some unknown place, and when they saw LC, their faces went pale with fear. She pulled over and the men parked right in front of her. When they turned around, her car had vanished into thin air. Later, still on Route 167, they saw a newer car pull up in front of a vintage car, which suddenly disappeared as well. The man in that car was shocked that they had shared a very similar story. The man from a country that does not exist. In 1954, a man at the Tokyo International Airport handed immigration officials his passport to be stamped. An officer was about to stamp it but realized that the country where it was issued was called Taurid, a country no one had ever heard of. The man was shocked and acted like they should all know about it. He claimed that it was located between France and Spain and had been a country for over 1,000 years. When the man was shown a world map, he pointed to what is now the Principality of Andorra. He was sure that they had a cheap and outdated map and became quite heated. They detained him and placed him in a room to interrogate him further. 2 guards were positioned outside the room, and when they went to retrieve him the next morning, he had vanished without a trace. The room's window was still locked from the inside, and the guards hadn't left their post all night. Ettore Majorana. Ettore Majorana was an Italian physicist who was considered in the same realm of genius as Galileo and Isaac Newton. In Germany, he worked with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Werner Heisenberg, but returned to Rome due to mental exhaustion. From 1933 to 1938, he became a hermit, shutting himself off from friends and family. Then, on March 25, 1938, he traveled by boat from Palermo to Naples and completely disappeared. In 1955, a photo surfaced in Argentina that looked exactly like Majara. An analysis from Rome's CSI team found 10 distinctive points of familiarity, as if he hadn't aged a day. Many believe that Majara fled Heisenberg after finding out that his work was being used for nuclear weapons, then used his knowledge of quantum mechanics to toil away on a time machine for those 5 years in solitude. Once his time machine was complete, he traveled to the 1950s to skip the Second World War altogether. A photo from the year 5000. In 2018, a man who wished to conceal his identity claims that he was sent to the year 5000 and that he brought back a picture as evidence. In 2004, he was working in a science lab in Los Angeles when he was, as he says, assigned the duty to visit the future and take photographs of what he saw. The photo he took is of Los Angeles completely submerged in the ocean. He claims that in the year 5000 he stood on a wooden floating city, and when he asked why LA was underwater, a man told him that the effects of global warming melted the ice at both poles, flooding most of the world. Since 2018, dozens of mainstream news sources around the world have covered the story, and no one has disproven it or the seemingly genuine-looking picture. A police officer dips in and out of the past. In 1996, a police officer named Frank walked along Bold Street in Liverpool when he suddenly entered a strange oasis of quietness. Suddenly, a van from the 1950s that read Cardin's sped by, narrowly missing him. His wife Carol was shopping at Waterstone's bookstore, but it now had a Crips sign over the entrance and was filled with handbags, not books. The people around him were all dressed in 1950s clothing, except one girl dressed in 90s fashion. He and the girl walked into the 50s-looking Crips, but it suddenly changed back to present-day Waterstones. The girl shook her head and said that was strange. I thought it was a new clothes shop. It was later determined that the building was a Crips in the 1950s, and Cardin's was a firm that owned the vans in the 1950s. This and many other similar instances became known as the Bold Street time slips. The many futuristic predictions of H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is known as the father of science fiction, and he had so many spot-on predictions that many people believe that he was a time traveler. His very first novel in 1895 was called The Time Machine, and he was also heralded as the father of futurology, the study of future possibilities. He wrote about lasers over 60 years before their invention, and about the atomic bomb 30 years before its invention. He wrote about virtual assistants like Alexa in 1899, and predicted wireless communication like the cell phones that we have, and the internet in 1923. He also wrote about the moon landing in his story The First Men on the Moon in 1901. That's almost 70 years before the Apollo 11 mission and 2 years before airplanes even existed. He seemingly always had his mind in the future and is even credited with creating the word foresight. In his case, the term ahead of his time is thought to literally mean that he returned to his time with those ideas from the future. An adventure through time. Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were the principal and vice principal of St. Hugh's College in Oxford, England. In 1901, they visited the Palace of Versailles in France, and as they explored the gardens, they felt a dreamy, eerie haziness and were seemingly dropped into another time. They saw Marie Antoinette painting, and she was surrounded by several other people in 1700s attire. As a tour guide approached them, the 1700s world suddenly disappeared. Later, they tried to retrace their steps, but it was impossible, since the paths and buildings looked totally different. They wrote a book about their experience called An Adventure, and the story gained notoriety because they were two highly educated and well-respected women who many thought would never make up such a story. Since then, it's become one of the most famous unexplained instances of time travel. Sergey Panarenko. In 2006 in Kiev, Ukraine, police found a confused man in outdated clothing holding a very old camera. His ID said that he was Sergey Panarenko from the Soviet Union, which had dissolved almost 20 years earlier. He looked to be in his 20s, but his birthday said 1932. When he thought that it was April 23, 1958, they took him to a mental hospital, where he told doctors that the last thing he remembers was taking a picture of a flying bell-shaped object. The camera was from 1956 and used a film that hadn't been made since the 1970s. The photos were all of Sergey in the clothes that he was wearing, in front of buildings that no longer existed, and the last picture showed the bell-shaped UFO. Sergey then went to his room and disappeared. Surveillance footage shows him entering the room but never exiting, and the windows had bars on them. Police found that Sergey was reported missing in 1958. They interviewed his now 70-year-old girlfriend, who said that he returned a couple days later, the same amount of time that he was in 2006. But that's all for this video. If you guys enjoyed this, please leave a like and a comment, and of course share this video, because all of those things help me out tremendously in the algorithm. And of course, if you'd like to see me live at any point, I'm live every single day on Twitch. Link is in the description. And other than that, I'll see you next time.